Your journey has been an interesting one up to here. You've questioned so much more than those around you. You've even questioned yourself as to how you could have grown into these thoughts. Am I crazy? When did I begin to think differently? Why do people in general appear so limited in their...
3, 2, 1. Hey, there's Spiritual Dope. We are on today with special guest Jonathan DePotter. Jonathan, I connected with through by way of a good friend of mine, Jeremy Todd. You were on his podcast, Positive Side. I don't know if you knew this, but Jeremy and I started our podcast journey at like the same time. He's stuck with his same one throughout this entire time. This is my third iteration. But Jonathan is the founder of Behold Retreats. He's passionate about plant medicine and believes that absolutely everyone can improve their mental health and consciousness. Jonathan believes that in these times of change, the single most valuable contribution any of us can make is to focus upon our own personal and spiritual development. Behold Retreats facilitates life-changing plant medicine journeys to explore your inner world, discover your truth, and live to your full potential. Jonathan, thanks for being on today.
Thanks for having me, Brandon. Real pleasure.
Absolutely. John, I got to ask this question before we even get going, right? Have you watched, was it 9 Perfect Strangers on Netflix?
No, but I've had enough friends mention it to me that I should watch it, but I haven't seen it myself. Yeah.
You'll have to check it out because, in my mind, I'm like, this is kind of how that could go, right? Kind of the gist is like, 9 people come to like this retreat. They've all got different backgrounds. No one knows each other. And somewhere in the midst of that, they're on psychedelics, and some people lose their shit, and it's crazy. It gets crazy because the people don't even. The one thing about this is that the people don't know that they're taking the psychedelics, and so I think that's a no-no, right? Right.
Yeah, our clients tend to know what they're signing themselves up for, and I think you raise an interesting point, and I think that's an interesting kind of inroad into this conversation. Is that as there are more commercial organizations moving into this space, what we can see is that there's kind of an upweighting of the positive and a bit of a downweighting of some of the challenging experiences that can arise, because it's pretty exciting to see the broad set of media headlines that sound pretty positive, but there's so much that's happening from a selection process and from a screening process and a filtering process that never makes it into the headlines. And so once often people click around on a few websites, they see a lot of things that they like, a few really positive testimonials, and maybe they've heard a good story from a friend or two, so they've got this kind of, shall we say, disproportionate version of the truth, which is that, hey, these are really positive experiences. And don't get me wrong, I'm obviously a proponent myself, but I think it's also important that people recognize that these can also be very challenging experiences.
Yeah, 100%. Don't ask me how I know, but that's great. So here's how I usually like to start this off with, the whole idea of Spiritual Dope is that we're conduits for, greater source energy, right? And everything kind of flows through us for a reason, right? We're not just here for, this podcast, this conversation. We're here to help somebody, right? Somebody on the other end of this is going to hear something, a special message that can only be delivered through you, through this podcast, to that person. What's that message today?
Yeah, I think it's much aligned to what you described in relation to allowing the life force to live and express itself completely through us. And that fundamentally for me is a process about relinquishing the egoic self, the illusion of the separate self, right? So, we're born into ignorance, and we grow up in an environment where, we're encouraged to develop and establish our identity and our ego. And that's, all very much part of life. But then I think, for a lot of us, we reach a point in life at which, the giving primacy to the external world is no longer working for us. And so that begins a deeper search of, asking questions. What am I here for? Who am I? What am I? Where am I? When am I? All of these fundamental questions. And so, I think whether people are inclined to use plant medicine or meditative practices or breath work or spiritual, religious practices, there's many paths that lead us to, the same place. But for people to begin to give primacy to their inner worlds and to relinquish their sense of egoic identity so that, the universe's life force can begin to shine through us, I think would be my fundamental message.
I love the idea of shine through us, right? It's definitely, I love that. How does a guy coming from one of the big top corporations in the world, right? Consulting practices, Accenture, how does this guy who's been super successful in that space end up being the guy who's like, you guys all need to come try this out. It's going to radically shift your world and your identity. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, well, I guess for me, it's been a funny and humbling return, because I actually come from quite spiritual and open-minded hippie parents. And so from a very young age, I went in the other direction. I grew up in Hawaii, which was a magical, beautiful place, but it also suffers from a lot of pretty dark substance abuse, and the energy around any substance use that I grew up around in that environment was pretty dark and pretty negative. So I swore off all of that entirely and went down the corporate route for many years. And, very blessed to have a successful career, mentored by some really exceptional people who, could consistently pull down $500 million in sales year after year, and just incredible people. And, at that time, I was an atheist. I didn't believe that there was anything greater than that which was, my own felt experience of 3D Newtonian material reality. And so I guess in my career, I just reached a stage. I was working in Hong Kong in management and strategy consulting with Accenture, and I just reached a stage where the next client, the next deal, the next thing wasn't going to bring me any incremental joy. And so I think, it was after a few too many drinks the night before. I remember looking at myself in the mirror before shipping off to work, and I was just going, I don't know what it is, but this isn't it. This isn't working for me anymore. So in that moment, I decided to take a year off. And as part of that, a couple of buddies and I found our way to a retreat in Peru. And so that was easily the most terrifying and challenging few nights of my life, and opened the door to spirituality, which I'm incredibly grateful for, and began me on a search of, what is spirituality? How can I improve my understanding of this new dimension of reality that was previously closed off to me? And attending a lot of retreats and making a lot of mistakes along the journey. So it wasn't until I felt like I had understood the nature of a lot of the mistakes that I was making that I had the confidence to actually step into this more professionally, to be able to guide people away from some of the simple mistakes that I had made over the years.
So I think it's funny. I was born in San Francisco in the late 70s to a couple of hippie parents, right? The legend is, and I've never really confirmed this, and I probably should, but I'm just going to keep working with legend, is that I was conceived on LSD, right? And then there's another little story. This one has been validated more recently, is that, when I was around 3 or 4 years old, I guess I'd found the mushroom stash and just like ran over, grabbed a handful, was like plop, and just like ran off and had a great time. So that's my story, began at a relatively early age. But the idea of and it's always been, hey, my mom's a hippie, right? That hippie mom. And the idea has always been like, I'm never going to be like that. Real similar to you, I guess, is like, that's not going to be my life. I guess one question I would ask is, at what point did you kind of go over to them and be like, all right, well, you might have been right in a couple places, right? And at what point, I guess, have you leveraged them as advisors on kind of what you're doing now? Because they've got, that experience behind them. So I'm curious about that.
Yeah, well, it was an interesting journey for me, because despite attending a lot of expensive 5-star retreats, there was some part of me that just felt instinctively, intuitively, that something was missing. So I was spending a lot of time meditating, reading all the right books, but I just felt like there was more. And so that's why I kept going to more and more of these retreats. I've got a great relationship with my parents, and I was pretty open with them in relation to what I was doing, the experiences. They had featured in my first retreat very strongly. And I'm actually helping my mom now with her own healing journey. She moved over about 8 months ago, and been doing a lot of work with her. She's got, unfortunately, a cancer diagnosis. But yeah, it was a very interesting evolution to admit that the stacks of books that I had ignored throughout my entire childhood had a lot of the wisdom in it that I was looking for, and that they were much on the right path in relation to their exploration and priorities in life, and that perhaps I was a little bit misguided, even though I thought I had all of the answers. So it's been a really humbling return.
What do they call that? Impetuous youth, right? And it's funny that you say that too. My mom could always be seen with like the I Ching book, right? Mm-hmm. Like on the weekends, kind of like doing the I Ching and whatever. And I got into it a little bit later, and I was into Carl Jung. I mean, dude's awesome, right? In this space, and he writes the foreword to an I Ching book, and it's like super awesome. You're like, oh, this is the one. And so I ordered it, and I'm like, oh my God, this is the exact same one that my mother had. The exact same. I was like, it's mind blowing, right? So I think it's just interesting to hear how sometimes that journey goes. So, I think one of the things that you talk about, and you talk about this just right here in this beginning, is, you come into this space, you had these experiences, and then the question becomes, all right, well, I've had this experience and this is awesome. What do I do with it? How do I integrate this? Let's talk about that. Cause I think you have two pieces. The first piece is like, you initially started doing week-long sessions, right? And then you changed that up a little bit. I'd love to hear how the first parts went and why you made those changes and what's that's looking like now.
Yeah, sure. So I guess my own experience, my own journey has been that we really need to focus on the mental and emotional work in the 3D as part of preparation and integration of these types of experiences. And so, I think one of the things that I say to people is, look at any psychedelic community or, place where people are doing lots of psychedelics. It's not that they necessarily are reflecting the energy that you might aspire to. So it's not that psychedelics or plant medicine are inherently positive. It really depends upon the intentionality that sits behind the use. And so if we're doing the mental and emotional work beforehand and getting really clear on our future self beforehand, then the medicine is able to respond to that intentionality and really show us what needs to be true in order to bring through that future self. Because I truly believe that, not a single one of us here is a random permutation of evolution. And I truly believe that any one of us can be whoever it is that we want to become, if we really anchor ourselves against that reality and do the work. And so what we tend to do with our clients is a 7-week process, 3 weeks before a retreat, a 1-week retreat, and then 3 weeks after the retreat. The 3 weeks before is, number one, helping them understand where they're at in life and where they'd like to be. Second to that, we help them really understand their thought patterns, right? So we've all got limiting thought patterns. There's some great stats out there from the National Science Foundation that I like to rattle off, which is your typical person has between 12,000 and 60,000 thoughts per day. Just about 100% of those are egoic thoughts. So they're I, me, my thoughts. Second to that, 95% of those thoughts are repetitive and 85% of those thoughts are negative. So we think all the time. We think only about ourselves. We think the same things about ourselves and mostly bad stuff. So helping people actually recognize some of these patterns of mind that have become so ingrained that they don't even see them anymore is super important in the lead up to the medicine work. So, these medicines help us regain our neuroplasticity, reconnect all the regions of our brain and also help us generate new neurons. That's great. But if we don't actually understand the patterns of mind that we're trying to rewire, then what tends to happen is that people feel really amazing after a retreat. And then, in the weeks that follow, what tends to happen is that the old thinking patterns, the old small subset of neural pathways that have been overused, just kind of, we just fall back into those default patterns. So that's a very important aspect of the preparation phase. The third and the final is really around emotional work, right? So there's a great book out there, The Body Keeps the Score. I think Gabor Mate's work, Wisdom of Trauma, etc., is really popularizing the understanding that for most of us, we've got a lot of these lower level traumas and energies stuck in our physical and energetic bodies. So the shame, the guilt, the fear, the grief, the apathy, the anger, the envy, the pride. These are all lower level vibrations that can be stored in our physical and energetic bodies. And so what we try to do for our clients is to help them, number one, to connect to that, and then number two, to begin to release these emotions even ahead of working with plant medicine. And so when we bring together these this understanding and these tools and this preparation, people tend to have a much better time on retreat.
Seems like a lot of work in 3 weeks, right? Yeah. So I guess the question I've got is, can somebody engage with you and do this over a longer process in 3 weeks?
Yeah, and we have done that for a number of our clients. It really depends on where people are at and their level of interest and dedication. The way that I look at these is that it's tools for life. They are not medicine dependent tools. They are practices that we can benefit from incorporating in our everyday life. And for a lot of our clients, they're busy people who prioritize their families and their work and a lot of other things. And so it's a large part of this work is to help them just spend, even at a minimum, a 7-week duration where they're prioritizing themselves for, an hour a day before and after the retreat, and then, solely on themselves during that week on location.
No, I get that. And I'm a fan of saying you're the giver and the gift, right? You've got to be able to give to yourself before you can give it to everybody else, right? So if you can give yourself a little bit of time, then you're able to amplify that and give that to others as long as you, and it's not as draining, right? Whereas like otherwise everybody's always giving of themselves, and they find themselves drained and worn out and blaming everybody else for their shit. And it's like, well, you don't give yourself anything, right? Yeah. You're the last person that gets you for yourself. So I love that, what you're trying to do here is make sure that they can see that if they spend some time on themselves, and 7 weeks is a relatively short period of time, given the whole life experience, to be able to find that. And the way you're doing it, I think you'd mentioned it before, is like with the psychedelic experience, this is like a amplification of like, you, like my wife was asking, I asked her right before I came down here, I said, are there any questions that you might have, right, as it relates to psychedelics? Because I'm well versed, well enough anyways. And she's like, I just don't get it, right? And I said, well, right now she's going to she's getting energy work done right now. Huh? Right? And it's challenging. She's having a tough time. Because she just wants it to be done. She's like, I just, here I am. I know I've got somewhere to get to, and I don't know where that is, but like, I just want to be there already. I was like, well, imagine like psychedelics kind of just accelerating that gap, right? Kind of, the work that you're doing, and it sounds a lot like what you're talking about. Go through this process, understand where you are today, feel your emotions, understand what those are today, and just kind of imagine what you'd like them to be. Now take this and call me in the morning.
Indeed. Sometimes when people ask me like, well, why would you want to take something like that? One of the ways that I describe plant medicine and psychedelics is that these medicines are trying to harmonize our mind, body, heart, and spirit to a single vibration. And then they're bringing us up and into a higher vibration. And through that process, what tends to happen, to steal your word, is that there's an amplification of the lower level dissonant energies, right? So it tends to bring to the surface these things from these places where often we don't want to look. And so that process in of itself, I think, removes doubt in terms of in terms of what it is that we need to work on to continue our elevation in consciousness. Because I think, whether or not people recognize this, that is what people are looking for. I often say to our clients, like, you don't actually want an ayahuasca retreat. You don't want a 5-MeO DMT retreat. What you're looking for is improvements to your quality of life. And that's going to come by doing, the mental and emotional work before and after the medicine work. And yes, the medicine is going to help you, but recognize that the medicine in of itself is not a silver bullet. There's some great science out there now that talks about how the medicine can, number one, help us reconnect with our joy for life. Number two, it can really deepen our spirituality and connection with the sacred. Both of those things are beautiful and amazing. And third, and most importantly, it does not remove our feelings of negativity and toxicity. So that's our own self-determination in the evolution of consciousness, right? If psychedelics in of themselves were solving that trifecta, then, we could expect that there'd be just billions of people walking around fully enlightened, still taking more psychedelics. But clearly that's not the case.
Yeah, there's some work that's got to go into it, right? You can't just have this thing and it does all the work for you. Like you're saying, it exposes this, I think more recently been studying shadow work, right? So it exposes these things that you've rejected for so long and forces you to face them. Yeah. Right. And you're like, man, I thought I was over that shit. I thought that was gone, and it's still sitting over there in the corner, in total neglect, and it's a wreck. Right. And now you've got to be like, there's no not facing it. Right. Like, it is there, clear as day. So I'd love to hear, what is the retreat like? What's happening at the retreat? Let's say I sign up, I've gone through my 3 weeks of work, I feel like I'm prepared, I'm like, Jonathan, I'm on the plane, I'm headed there. When I land, what's going to happen?
Yeah, so we do different types of retreats in different locations. I would say about half the work that we do is actually private retreats, where we've got one or potentially two clients, often a husband and wife, and we've got a couple of healers, yoga practitioner, facilitator, looking after them for the duration of the week. So that is a really beautiful container. It allows a lot of intensive work and a lot of attention from the very skilled healers that we have on the team. So, some people, when they're starting on this journey, most people, I would say, they start in a group setting. There's a kind of felt safety in numbers, we're all in this together. And then there's a lot of people who also say, like, look, I don't want to hear anyone else's experience. I want to be focused on completely and entirely and not have to worry about any other human beings. And, both of those completely makes sense. It's just a matter of preference for individuals. So most of our retreats are with ayahuasca or 5-MeO DMT, also known as the God molecule or Bufo. And with ayahuasca, it tends to be more group retreats. We do much smaller groups than are typically out there. Most retreat centers run between 15, 20, 25. There's even some places that do 50 or 100 people in a room. We tend to do group sizes between 6 and 8. Which just, again, it allows a lot more attention. Typically over the space of a week, we will do 3 medicine ceremonies. So 3 nights where we're drinking the medicine. And then around that, we might do some horseback riding on the beach or a jungle hike, plenty of time for resting, reflection, journaling, beautiful meals, maybe spend some time near the pool, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a nice balance of, connecting with some great human beings, doing the hard work, some rest, and also some more immersive nature-based activities to really not only connect with our own nature, but the collective mother nature, which is often so missing from our clients' lives because they're busy people that are coming down from cities for the work. So that tends to be the kind of the format for ayahuasca. Quite similar for our group retreats with 5-MeO DMT. The contrast would be that we tend to individualize the ceremonies a little bit more because the peak of the experience is much shorter. An ayahuasca ceremony tends to go between 4 to 9 hours, depending upon the number of times that people drink and their own individual experiences. Whereas with 5-MeO DMT, the peak of the experience tends to be 20 or 30 minutes or so, and so that allows a little bit more individual attention. But for group retreats, there again, we keep group size very small, so it tends to be between 4 to 6, sometimes 7 people on our group retreats.
No, I like that. You mentioned like 50 to 100 people. In my mind, I come from the rave experience, right? I was like, you just add a little bit of music to that, and you've got the rave experience. So that's a lot, and it could also turn into, to me, it could also turn into a shit show. You better have enough handlers available to, for those people that have a bad experience, because that becomes a chain reaction. Right, you've got a bunch of people; they're in a massively heightened sense of whatever. Right, their senses are just like, right, ultra magnified, and then you've got somebody losing their shit, right, and that's just going to cause like a cascading thing unless you've got somebody able to really be able to handle that.
That's exactly it, and on an energetic level as well. There's people are clearing their childhood trauma, et cetera, and so these energies are leaving one person, and unless that energy is being very well managed in the room, they're potentially entering another person. And I know that sounds, for some perhaps sounds a little bit wacky, but that is the reality. So we unfortunately sometimes pick up clients that have gone to one retreat where the energies haven't been well managed. They haven't had a particularly, positive experience, and indeed sometimes they've picked up some energies that weren't their own from the retreat itself. So it's I think we live in a very interesting time in relation to plant medicine and psychedelics, because what we can see is that there's kind of now the Western clinical model, which is gaining a lot of speed. But it's not necessarily getting the degree of cross-pollination that we might hope for from the ancient wisdom traditions that exist in, Central and South America, for example. And so, the Western understanding of the emotional trauma and the mental work to be done, and in the clinical setting is great, because that kind of fits your typical Western city dweller. But their understanding of the energetic aspects of this work, they don't even acknowledge it in the clinical trials to a great degree. And so we're busy at CIS and Johns Hopkins training hundreds and thousands of psychedelic therapists that have fundamentally no understanding about the energetic aspects of this work. So I'm hopeful that we see a little bit more convergence over the period ahead, to also take into account the energetics, so that we can more predictably give people positive results in the clinical setting, because I think that's a large part of what's missing, and a large part of why people continue to travel for these experiences to, shamans, to healers, and in Costa Rica, Mexico, Peru, etc., where there's an understanding of these energetic aspects.
Do you think that's because of funding?
Do I think that oversight is because of funding within the academic and clinical world?
Right. Like if I go to somebody looking for funding and I'm talking about like, plasticity and, productivity enhancement and all this other stuff. And I'm like, oh yeah, we need to make sure we have a couple dollars in there for like, energy transference and all this other stuff. Right. I mean, I think that's hard to translate to a lot of people in Western society. So yeah, do you think that relates to getting funding for this?
Yes, I think you raise an interesting point. So I've actually connected some of our most talented healers with some of the preeminent psychedelic clinicians and therapists, and a lot of what they do is protocol design, and they're desperate for better protocols, because even though they do a lot of filtering and selection on the groups and the control groups for these trials, they're not as positive as some of the headlines might lead us to believe in terms of the outcome. So, of course, what that's leading them to look at is the protocols and how they can improve them. But I think you're exactly right. Within the academic world, the academic world is still entirely oriented around the Newtonian worldview, right? And scientific kind of determinism. So, they're hopeful that they can take a person with, X depression and feed them, and do 2 therapy sessions and feed them, 2 milligrams of synthetic psilocybin, and then do 2 more therapy programs, and there'll be a measurable improvement to, A, B, and C test scores. That's what they're hoping for. Whereas I think, and along with that, I've also heard that some of the trials are even providing what they call vomit suppressants. So, in terms of energetic release, often vomiting can be a really important part of that healing process, as kind of nasty as it may sound. But in some cases, they're actually suppressing that outcome. And so, people aren't going to be getting the same results. But I think you're absolutely right in relation to funding and ridicule within the academic communities, because they fundamentally don't acknowledge, and they're not, the scientists themselves are encouraged not to participate in any of these sorts of medicines themselves. So we've got a really interested in pretty twisted dynamic, actually, where people who are meant to lead others to a higher state of consciousness are not able to elevate their own consciousness in that same fashion that they're trying to lead others to. So the analogy that comes to mind is like, we've got scuba instructors trying to lead expeditions to the top of Everest. It just makes absolutely no sense. And there is one of the other ways to kind of bring it back to vibration. Often that's the common language when we speak to psychedelic scientists and the more spiritually inclined people. We can come back to vibration as a common language. And there is, what's happening when you're working with a healer that's reached a higher vibration is that two frequencies in the physical world, if you have two frequencies, the lower frequency will harmonize up to the higher frequency. So that's fundamentally a part of what's happening when you're going to work with an advanced healer, is you're just spending time with someone who's operating at a higher frequency. And yes, that means that they can probably do more for you from a healing perspective. But if you, again, wind back to that clinical setting, that person doesn't exist in the room. And so the chances of you breaking through and sustaining a higher level of consciousness just by virtue of, the medicine is a much lower chance at a real breakthrough or sustained benefits.
I'm trying to think of the book. It's The Secret Passage of India, My Secret India. I forget the book, but it sounds a little bit like brain entrainment, right? If you set yourself to these certain frequencies with brain entrainment, your brain's supposed to get there. But also if you sit around like a yogi, for example, you sit in the same room, you meditate with them, you're gonna connect with that vibration inherently just by being in the presence of that person, right? And I think that's obviously, you bring it back to like ridicule, right? Like, again, I don't want to. So here's what I think, perspective, funder. Talking about that, and kind of, it's really tough to ask for money for things people can't see, right? Yeah. And the other thing you brought up too, which I think is really interesting. There's a couple things. Talk about like measurable improvements. Now, if you're looking for, if we're at a workforce, right? If maybe we're back at Accenture, and a measurable improvement there for a business and a company is like dollars and cents. Right. And what we're looking for from a person, there's a measurable improvement in my mind would be like, have you reconnected with your heart, your mind, and are you acting in your life in alignment? Right. So what are the specific measurable improvements that they're looking for?
You're talking about clients when they come to us?
Well, it like say Johns Hopkins, right? If they're doing the clinical studies and they're looking for measurable improvements, yeah. What are the said measurable improvements?
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch, and this is an area that I will profess my relative ignorance, because I don't go down the rabbit holes in relation to the clinical model on the back of my conversations with clinically oriented people, to be honest, because I just haven't been impressed relative to what the healers are able to share with me. But in essence, there's a broad set of standardized tests that have been established, right, in relation to, could be quality of life, could be thought patterns, and they've got different numbers, and you can actually look, you can look these up, and there's these basic standard tests that have been established. And so it's to a great degree, it's to allow cross-pollination of results between different types of efforts that are trying to improve people, right? So if we establish kind of some common tests that can then be used as language to contrast, say, let's just say comparing the benefits of a 10-day nature retreat to a psychedelic retreat to a meditation retreat to just spending, some weeks not working with your family for the sake of conversation and seeing, what improvements to your felt experience may arise out of different settings. So that's in my basic understanding, that is why they've established these common sets of tests, and so that they can use them across a broad variety of research, in essence.
I like that. And then, the using synthetic, have you been able to yourself determine a difference between a synthetic version of psilocybin and a actual mushroom? I mean, are they the same?
Yeah, it's a great question, actually. So the energy that sits behind a medicine is of such great importance to the quality of the experience itself. And so, this is something I would have laughed at 5 years ago, but, some of the best healers that I've met and, worked with myself, but also, put clients in the direction of, they only work with mushrooms that are sung mantras to each day. So people who take care of these mushrooms actually take like really good spiritual and energetic care of these mushrooms. And that's important. And so, when people say, oh, we've got a new 50,000 square foot facility and we're going to crank out this many mushrooms, it's like, yeah, that's a really got a different energy behind it. And it's really interesting, right? Because I spend, when I launched Behold Retreats, I spent quite a bit of time understanding the ecosystem ahead of choosing our direction. And it was fascinating that a lot of people are bringing in, that desire to patent and control these medicines and to develop new medicines so that, other people can't use them, rather than using the natural medicines themselves. And so what's been interesting is that I can see that a lot of these big organizations that have, some hundreds of millions or billions of dollars behind them, are struggling to attract good healers, which is obviously pretty important given the nature of the work. And I think they're also going to be using some of these medicines that aren't necessarily in the best interest of the clients.
You're talking about the energy that sits behind the medicine, and how important that is. And that reminded me of the work, Dr. Emoto, when he does like all that, shouting at the water stuff and freezing it in the crystals and kind of how that goes. I mean, I'm going to be dead honest with you. It's pretty funny. I take, because of that experiment, right? I'll take my water sometimes and I'll take one of these tuning forks, right? That's supposed to, be energetically healing because water has memory, and I'll bang it and I'll put it on my water just so that it gets like a good vibration in it, and I'll drink it, right? Just and why not? Like, what's the worst thing that could possibly happen, right? At least my water's got the intention of some type of goodness going through it, because prior to my water getting here, I can only imagine, like, sitting on the trucks, driving through the city, people yelling at it, giving it the finger, the driver's like, screw this, right? Or like, just sits there in the warehouse, much like these other mushrooms that you're talking about. People are working there, they're schlepping into work every day. It's like, can deal with the mushrooms. This place smells like shit. I hate this job, right? Who wants to eat mushrooms like that? Like, whatever. Who wants anything that comes from that space?
Yeah. Well said. And I think, it's in the end, it's all energy, right? And with a lot of our clients, it's what we really, often they're like, okay, this is such a great experience. What am I looking for? What am I doing now when I'm going back to the real world? It's just like, just try to be more observant about not just the thing, but the energy behind the thing, right? And I think that's a journey that just has so many benefits to it, of just beginning to observe, whether we're talking about food, whether we're talking about water, whether we're talking about people, whether we're talking about a business deal, just being much more sensitive to the energy of the thing rather than the thing itself.
100%. And this is something that you offer at the retreats. It's not inexpensive. It's geared towards leaders. You want to tell me a little bit about why that is? Yeah.
So, actually, Gabor Mate in his recent film did a little piece to this that kind of points to the fact that at the moment our world is being led by people who respond most positively to competition, if I may say so. So these are the people who, throughout their schooling years, throughout their university and into their careers, they're just working a little bit harder. They're pushing themselves a little bit harder than everyone else. And the question is, well, why is that? And fundamentally, I think the understanding that's emerging is that these are the people who have been most traumatized. These are the people who are most disconnected from themselves internally. And so the world is being led by the most traumatized people. And so when it comes to why is that who we're targeting? Well, because those are the people who, obviously have pushed themselves pretty hard in life. Often they're pretty disconnected from themselves. They really need help. Whether or not they know it is entirely a different story. I had actually been hopeful that, given my years in the corporate world and broad professional network, et cetera, that there would be a lot of people who, as I kind of evolved and migrated into this space, be like, oh, great, really looking forward to coming and join you on the retreat. It's not the case. People really need to feel the calling in order to be willing to, look into what's actually going on in their subconscious and work towards harmonizing that. So, these people do need quite a lot of care. There's often one of the things I say to people is that, there's a kind of narrative that there's a right way to do these medicines. And that's to do that in a group context, down in Costa Rica or Peru. But I'm always reminding people that, that was the right thing for a tribal community that used to do these rites of passage, every few years at a minimum together. Right. And so you would come out of this context of community and culture and sit with, some of your tribe and perhaps some of the elders. And then you would be returned to that, that container, that community, that tribe as part of the integration process. In contrast, what we've got today is people, finishing up their day trading in New York City on Friday, flying down to Costa Rica or Peru and Mexico and, doing a week's worth of medicine work, and then not having that same support, that same container. And, coming into that context, often they've got 10 generations of intergenerational trauma that hasn't been processed in any way, shape, or form. And it's not necessarily that the shamans themselves, having done a lot of this work through the generations, they're not, historically, they're not used to working with that level of trauma that often a Westerner is coming down with. So it's pretty sensitive work. And, I think the more successful the person, the further they are into their career. There's a higher degree of compartmentalization because they're managing a much higher degree of, a much higher number of people. They're managing a much higher degree of complexity. And so the degree to which their thinking has become highly patterned just to deal with that overwhelming amount of complexity is quite high. And so as everything begins to shift mind, body, heart, and spirit in the ways that it needs to for the healing process to unfold, that can lead to some very challenging situations.
No doubt, right? I'd certainly never thought about it, never heard about it kind of presented in the manner that you just did, that, our leaders are the most traumatized of people out there. It says a lot. And one of the things, and one of my thoughts, Jonathan, had been, this compartmentalization. I can see that, right, 100% in dealing with leaders that I've dealt with. One of the things that I feel like the pandemic brought for us was kind of it leveled the playing field, right? Because everybody went through this thing at the same time, and the leaders that I was exposed to through the pandemic that were experiencing this at the same time, like there was nobody that got away free on that, right? So everybody had to experience like, hey, I'm shut down, I'm locked at home, I can't get out. Oh shit, we're all human again, right? So I thought that was a really interesting experience. But one of the reasons I guess that I thought, like, and correct me if I'm wrong, or this may be still part of addressing the leaders. Here are the people that just much like yourself, like, I had this amazing experience, and I can go share it with people now. And due to the fact that, you're not a hippie, sitting by the river, doing whatever hippies do, they're like, well, there might be something behind that. So if it comes from somebody who's leader in a prominent position, and they come back normal and able to, like, I don't know, rehumanize themselves a little bit. To me, that's one of the reasons that you're like, hey, leaders, let's do this with leaders.
Absolutely. And I think, the leaders, the elevation of consciousness I see is an exponential process. And I think there's spiritual significance to this virus to help us accelerate that, because it's just become so desperately necessary. And there's a lot there for leaders as well to help them really tap into their intuition, right? Whereas we might have, spent weeks and months looking at different option analysis and discounted cash flows and messing with the variables on the financial models, all of that super analytic stuff. Now, if you tap into your intuitive heart and that connection is wired in the ways that it needs to be, then all of a sudden you'll surprise yourself. Out will come 4 sentences that makes it so self-evident what the right answer is for customers, therefore the business, therefore everyone on the team, and everyone can just get moving without having to do all of this, deeply technical, rational work. And so I think part of what's exciting is I think that we collectively have the opportunity to move to what I would describe as post-rationalism, right? Where it's not based upon scarcity. It's not based upon fear. It's not based upon trying to maximize extraction at the expense of, planet or some other third party, whatever. But that, we begin to unify. And I think a big part of that is recognizing that we're all here to give rather than just trying to maximize what we get.
Jonathan, I get it, right? I'm in. I'm all in. But if again in leadership positions, it's everything's got to be linear, right? You talk about the post-rational. So in the rational mind, everything is linear. It's got to happen like this. And I'll hear the line, right? Well, we're looking for linearity here. Well, I don't know how many times you've ever gotten involved in a project from day one to the end of a project. We're looking at I don't know what the sales cycles were at Accenture, but I think that once you get to the $20 million mark that you'd mentioned, in your Be Bold comment, right? You don't ask, you don't get, right? The idea of a sales cycle is like 18 months, right? So when you start 18 months to 24 months, you're like linear. There's no linearity there, man. There's like a bunch of shit goes into that, and it's a lot of work. Yeah. The only linearity is like, hey, we said we were aiming for this, and we got pretty close, right? So I guess what I'm trying to get at is like, what does post-rational look like? Post-rational to me, when you say it, looks like it stops being linear, it stops being explicitly 3D, and there are so many other dimensions that go into it.
Yeah, I think a large part of it is people tuning into their own internal guidance systems, right? So, for me, for example, whenever I'm faced with decisions, I tune in and I ask questions, and I can feel there's an energy spike when I get a positive, and there's more of a, I would say, kind of a sinking feeling down and into the gut when I'm getting a negative. And so I can compare and contrast, and I use that pretty exclusively as a mechanism. There's some great work that's out there by Dr. David Hawkins on kinesiological testing, and he kind of defined the levels of consciousness through a very similar sort of approach. It's more muscle based, and that has been turned out. It's been kind of tossed out as pseudoscience, but so it was the case with plant medicine as well, and psychedelics as well. So I think we will come to update our rational understanding with more spiritual tools over time, not just individually, but collectively. And so, I think when we begin to calibrate ourselves energetically, then we can begin to rely on these tools with a much higher degree of confidence. It's a journey, it's something that takes time, it takes energy. And I think, but I think, just to give one such example, I think, we get a lot of clients who go on retreat and immediately are making massive changes to their lifestyles. We're talking about like buying a house the very next week in Costa Rica, and making big shifts, because I think a lot of us feel it, like the systems that we've established have kind of played out their roles to a great degree. They're no longer supporting the thriving and flourishing that we inherently know is possible for us collectively. And so, people are very much beginning to vote with their feet and moving to places where they feel like they can, express themselves freely and completely and connect with other like-minded people. And I think most importantly, or as importantly, really reconnect with land. I think there's this kind of felt scarcity that we're all trying to maximize our leverage and get 3 or 4 investment properties. And, there's this kind of, illusion of scarcity that so many of us are bought into. Again, it goes alongside with the illusion of the separate self. And so because of this illusion of scarcity, we're making, decisions that are not in our individual or collective best interests. And so I think it'll be important, I think, as over the period ahead, I think markets are going to begin to get a really big shake, and people are going to be looking at, okay, how do I reconnect with my sense of abundance in a more direct way in terms of growing food, for example, and making sure that that we're taking care of the land and the land is taking care of us, as opposed to these crazy abstractions where people are, so dedicated to maintaining the illusion of scarcity that they're paying $400,000 for a photo of a monkey that people can, generate in the space of 20 minutes. It's wild.
Yeah, it is absolutely mind-boggling. And I always, whenever I'm flying across the country or whatever, and we're talking about scarcity, right? We're talking about real estate. Oh, we got to go live in this place, and then you fly across the country, and there's like so much like land and like green space. You're like, nobody's here. Like nothing's happening here. And I know that like I could go do something here. So I feel that in my bones for sure. You mentioned David Hawkins, big fan of him as well. The book that you're talking about, Power versus Force, talks a little bit about that kinesiology. I heard you talking to Jeremy and talking about letting go. That's literally right here next to me. It's not showing up, but it's funny because it is. I didn't go get this book to bring it out. I had it sitting here with me. Thought that was pretty entertaining.
We recommend recommend that one to 100% of our clients, and they all just absolutely love that book. It's just such a simple tool. The fact that it introduces a scale is something that people absolutely love, because we love to place ourselves on scales. It's just part of the human condition, and it does an accurate job of I think each of the levels of consciousness. There's one that we can identify with more than the others. We all shift a little bit up and down, but there'll be one there that we can all identify with because it reflects how we see the world. And so it's such an amazing tool.
No, I absolutely love it. I always talk about level 200, which is courage. Right. And once you get to the level of courage, like that's the tipping point, right? That's when you talk about people hearing that call that you're talking about, that's that level of courage. When you answer that call, that's the courage, right? And then that begins your tipping point, your cascade forward, if you will. Jonathan, is there anything else that you wanted to talk about as it related to Behold retreats in the time that we've got right now?
No, I guess the last thing I'd say would be for anyone who's thinking about a journey with plant medicine, really encourage everyone to connect with their own individual why. There's a whole bunch of stuff out there saying good things, like ignore that broadly. Really understand for yourself like why you would want to do this, and spend some time and energy researching this for yourself ahead of exploring different options that may exist in terms of retreats and guidance and . So I think that's the message that I like to put out there for any who feel the calling and would like to connect with us. Come say hello. There's no book now button on our website. Got to speak to a real human, and you'll speak to either me or one of my team.
Awesome. So we're at this little point. I've got a couple more pieces here for you. And one is, I kind of look at this podcast as spiritual speed dating, right? Like somebody's going to come in, they're going to check out this podcast. They're looking like you were on your journey, right? You're like, what's the next book I need to read? What's the next podcast I need to listen to? I got to get all the information. And then there's going to be that person that you finally vibed with, right? You vibe with David Hawkins. You're like, I'm going to follow this guy. I'm going to implement the stuff that he says. So, same thing here, right? So somebody's going to tune in and check out and they'll be like, oh, I'm totally into Jonathan and I got to call him. So, in that vein, I have one question I'm actually going to ask you. Are we all one?
Absolutely. 100%. We're all the modulation of a single consciousness. And that's what's exciting about this work, is once we remove those things that we are not, the trauma, the negativity, the over-identification with the mind, and we can connect with our higher selves, then we realize that we are all one.
And I love it, right? So for somebody who, what does that actually mean, right? Like, if I see you eating lunch over there, is that me eating lunch? Like, how are we all one? How exactly? I mean, it sounds great, Jonathan, but what does that actually mean?
Yeah, it's that therein lies the mystery. And often when we speak about these experiences or mystical experiences in a broad sense, right, they're often described as ineffable, irreducible back to natural language, right? But in the context of what does this mean, we are all one, I think what's important is that it has such deep ramifications for how we think about one another, because everything that we see is genuinely a reflection of self. Everything that we judge, everything that has negativity associated with it, everything that has a trigger associated with it, everything that we see as wrong with the world that we might like to improve, generally says something about ourselves. And what also is interesting about this is that as people develop this, shall we say, difference in understanding of the nature of suffering and the nature of consciousness in the world, sometimes it can sound a little bit unempathetic, right? Because you're saying, well, it's all a reflection of consciousness, and it is what it is. Now, that being said, of course, we all want people to be doing well and doing better. But fundamentally, everything is a reflection of consciousness. Everything is created in mind and then manifest into this 3D stage that we call the game of life. And so being able to abstract ourselves and look down on our own consciousness from a higher point of consciousness is fundamentally what this work is all about, whether we're talking about plant medicine or not. And so, I think what's encouraging is that we are at a stage where, certainly the wisdom traditions over the eons have said the same things, the same messages over and over again. Now the quantum physicists are telling us much of the same things, right? That every atom has some sort of base level of consciousness. And now we've got the scientists pursuing psychedelics and telling us that it's the quote unquote mystical experience that gives people the best chances at improving their quality of life and their quality of understanding of self and the outer world. But there's actually a great CIA paper I'd be happy to share with you that I think does a really good job of actually describing the nature of the universe. So it's, one of the things that I think is helpful for people is actually to go rewatch the Matrix as a documentary rather than as a thriller or an action film. Because in the beginning, Neo's kind of lost and, looking for answers and ... And the end of it, he is the Matrix, right? So he is the fundamental structure of the universe at the end of the film. And that's what we are. And so the CIA paper describes this in pretty exceptional terms, actually. And so they use the nature of the universe as a matrix of consciousness, of which each of us is a hologram. So it's we are a part that reflects the whole universe. And so as we reach higher states of consciousness, we are then able to access this matrix of consciousness. The Akashic records is another term that's often used. And indeed, all information that is encoded within the universe is available to any single one of us who calibrates their antenna to such a point at which they can access this information. There are rules and regulations, as you might expect, that govern the use of this information, which is why these things can't be used for nefarious purposes. And that's also proven a limiting factor for, shall we say, some of the forces at work within this planet that might like to use some of these quote unquote capacities / technologies, whatever we want to call it, for things that are not in the interest of the highest good.
Jonathan, must I be pure of heart to enter?
100%.
No doubt. No doubt. Jonathan, thanks for being on today, man. Definitely a pleasure. There's so much more that I'd love to cover, but our time is here today is limited. And I think that what you shared today is just a teaser. So anybody who is definitely looking to learn more, where should we send them to find out more?
Yeah, come and check us out. We're on behold-retreats.com or on Instagram at behold_retreats. And look forward to having a chat and seeing whether we're a mutual fit.
Thanks again, Jonathan.
Thank you, Brendan.
Really hope you enjoyed this episode of the Spiritual Dope Podcast. Stay connected with us directly through spiritualdope.co. You can also join the discussion on Facebook, Spiritual Dope, and Instagram at spiritual_dope. If you would like to speak with us, send us an email through brandon@spiritualdope.co. And as always, thank you for cultivating your mindset and creating a better reality. This concludes the most thought-provoking part of your day. Don't forget to like and subscribe to stay fully up to date. Until next time, be kind to yourself and trust your intuition.